Hi, everybody. I'm Veronica Gedwich, President of the Irvington Historical Society, and thank you all for joining us today. We're excited to be conducting our first hybrid event with a live audience here at the Irvington Library and a virtual audience on Zoom. This is the first time we've done it, and it's all thanks to our board members, Chet Kerr and Nado Sadran. The program is being recorded and will be posted on our website, www.irvingtonhistoricalsociety.org. Our speaker, Joe Edelman, will have a question and answer session at the end of his talk. So if you're attending online, please post your questions in the chat, either during or at the end of the program. And for those of you attending in person, our speaker has brought copies of his book to purchase. Perhaps the best person to introduce the speaker is someone who taught him right here in Irvington. She's now retired, but taught Latin for 42 years, 30 years here in Irvington, and she's fondly remembered by her many students, including my own children. Michelle Seller.
Thank you, Veronica. That was very nice. As a Latin student, as a Latin teacher or any teacher, we don't often get to get feedback about how we did during our career. And I have been very lucky teaching in the Irvington community. The community was so supportive. It does take a village to raise a child, and I could not have done it. We could not have done it in Latin without the participation of the community. Most of the people in this audience, at least the ones at whom I'm looking, I taught their children. And I can only tell you that the passion of my life has been to teach Latin, and it's a reciprocal agreement. You give to us as educators and we give back to you. And I like to think that the students in Irvington really have tried to give back to their parents and to the community. And I can't imagine a community more supportive of education than this one. So this is not about me, but about Joseph Michael Edelman. And in 1994, I met Joe when he was a first-year Latin student. I was also at the time the coach of the academic decathlon team. America had discovered a few years earlier that it isn't just sports that bring in the audience, but suddenly people were very, very excited about Jeopardy. And my own mother never missed Jeopardy. And people, her family from France would call in and talk to her about questions. And it had really become all the rage. And education then decided to add in that component. And we had an academic decathlon team at Irvington, and it consisted of 4 students who would compete against 4 other students from anywhere in Westchester. We ultimately joined a league that was tri-state, New York, Connecticut, New Jersey. I encouraged all of my Latin students at the time to also join Academic Challenge. And I felt that it shouldn't just be for the special students, it should be for all students, because you'd be surprised how many kids out there are masters at a particular subject. It could be, bowling, it could be instrumental music, and yet you'd never know it in the classroom. So we used to travel with 4 teams, not just an A and a B, but 4 teams, and everybody got a chance to play. Usually freshmen did not show up on the A team. That was pretty much reserved for upperclassmen. So in January of '95, I decided to do something a little bit revolutionary, having watched my freshmen play for 5 months. And our January tournament, 1995, played a freshman. It was Joe Edelman, and I can't tell you how much heckling I got from the other coaches, because Joe at the time was diminutive, to say the least. And we intentionally did not allow him to sit last seat because it would have made him psychologically perhaps feel like the least. So we buried you in the middle. You always played, I think, Keith Berman to your right. Yeah. And we won that big tournament in January, and that sort of, set the tone. And we not only won that, but we then won every other tournament, including the Texaco Challenge, for $25,000, which was divided up among the teammates for scholarships. Joe had to wait 4 years to get his because he was a freshman. We were invited to nationals, and that was the winner from 50 states. And again, Joe ended up, we did not win. We were the only public school to make it into the top 10, and were eliminated at number 7 by Klein Forest, Texas. Do you remember? I remember. It was a private school. But Joe was, they kept scores, not only for the teams, but for all the individual players, was ranked the #1 freshman in the nation at the time. So he, that may have been your high point in life, but it was wonderful. And Joe had, how you talk about poker players having a tell. Joe had a little bit of a tell. You had to have watched him for a while. First of all, his feet did not reach. He hooked his feet around the chair because in nationals you're on this, much different stage. But whenever you have about 6 seconds to answer a question, math, you got a little bit more. And so my heart would beat quickly until I could see Joe make a slight motion forward and then sort of move his back. I don't know if it was hooking his feet or whatever. And I knew he was going to answer it. Once in a while, the coach would say, well, yeah, but he's, all he's doing is answering. And I'd say, no, we've got it. And what was wonderful about that team, Joe, is that you all trusted each other. They all knew that one of them was there for math, one was there for science, one was a generalist, one was literature, Dave Brazil. And they didn't steal each other's questions. They trusted Joe as a freshman to stick to his category. And, if within six seconds, if no one else on the team answered, you could answer, and Joe did. Anyway, it was a glorious beginning. I had Joe for 4 years in academic challenge, and because he is one of 4 boys in the Edelman family, I had an Edelman pretty much for the next decade or so. In fact, one year when I didn't have an Edelman and we lost a match, a coach sitting next to me very snidely said, what, no, you're between Edelmans this year? So that was the reputation of the Edelman boys. Joe left me to go to Harvard. Just one small aside on this. Harvard has a graduation requirement that you must know how to swim. And at the time, although now with 3 children, I suspect you've learned how to swim, but you could not graduate unless you could swim. So Joe used to joke he may be the only student ever admitted to Harvard who will not graduate. So at some point, you must have passed the requirement to take up for the fish. Oh, okay. Joe graduated with a degree in history and went on to do his graduate work at Johns Hopkins. He had the good luck, and I like to think good sense, to recognize that someone also in the history department at Johns Hopkins, Sarah Mulhall, was the girl for him. And I think they probably recognized each other across the room because, like Elizabeth I, they are described as gingers. And in case, it's a shame you don't see their 3 children, Nicholas, Lizzie, and Rebecca here, because you could pick them out of a crowd too, as all gingers. Both Sarah and Joe found work after they graduated with their PhDs at Framingham State University in Massachusetts. And I'll at this point go to the papers. Joe is now an associate professor. His wife is also a professor in the Department of Colonial History. Sarah teaches 19th century American history. Joe is an historian of media and communication and politics, and his first book is about that. His first book, The Business and Politics of Print and the News, 1763 to 1789, was published in 2019, and afterwards you can purchase for $22, I believe. For some unknown price, you can purchase his book afterwards. He is also published widely in academic journals and publications such as Slate, the Washington Post, and the Atlantic. In 2019, he was elected as a member of the American Antiquarian Society, one of the oldest learned societies in the United States. In addition, he is project coordinator for the Across America 1776 initiative at the, watch the pronunciation here, Omohundro Institute of Early American History and Culture. where he's working to develop events related to the American semi, it's Latin, I should do this, quincentennial in 2026. I cannot tell you how proud I am of Joe. In addition, we have many parents in this audience and hopefully on Zoom whose children I taught, and the Ryans, who are very active in the historical side. Their son, Hugh, has just published his second book. Come on, Joe. And there are several of the children of the kids I'm looking at here, of the parents here who have done wonderful things. All of them have done wonderful things regardless, but because of the way they were raised well in Irvington, and they were raised well in the Irvington education system. And I think it's, I'm very, very proud of all my students, especially Mr. Joe. So I present to you Joe Edelman.
Thank you for that introduction. I will restrict myself to saying one thing about Ms. Sella, which is one of the things I learned from her is that my teaching style relies very strongly on digressions. And actually sometimes tell my students that you are where I get it from. So I would like to thank those of you who are in the room and however many people are on Zoom for joining me this afternoon. This talk has been a long time in coming. I first talked to, I can't call her by her first name, Mrs. Ryan, Hugh's mom, sometime in 2019 about scheduling a talk for April of 2020. And what surprises me in retrospect about that is actually how long we waited to cancel. I think it might have been April before we realized that it wasn't going to happen, and we rescheduled it, and then the Delta wave hit. So this is take 3 on this talk. So I'm very glad to get to be giving it. And I want to thank Mrs. Ryan and Patricia Bonamy, who's part of the Irving Historical Society and a noted historian of colonial New York, which I never realized growing up that there was this famous historian living among us. But there you go. And of course, to Ms. Sella for the introduction. So we are just down the hill from a statue of Rip Van Winkle and just downriver from Washington's Irving's house, and not all that far from the Catskill Mountains, where Irving set one of his most famous stories about Rip Van Winkle. So this week in preparation, I texted my parents and asked if they could take a picture of the statue up on Main Street, because the ones online are relatively either low resolution or they have watermarks all over them. And about 20 minutes later, I got this. Thanks, Dad. And then about 6 hours later, I got a nice, delightful photo that wasn't just a selfie. So for those of you who don't know, Rip Van Winkle was originally published by Irving in 1819 as part of a short story collection called The Sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon Gentleman. So it was written in the voice of Crayon, and actually the Rip Van Winkle story is written in the voice of Crayon, finding papers of a fictional historian named Dietrich Knickerbocker that he'd created for other work that he had written. So there's this whole, Dr. Mo is here, so I want to be careful about how much literary analysis I do, but there's a whole layering of authorship and voicing going on in the story. So Rip Van Winkle is a henpecked husband. He's beloved in his village as a well-meaning friend and storyteller, but he's also rather lazy. So one day he goes up into the Catskills with his dog and stumbles upon a group of mystical men who are playing something like some sort of game and drinking, and he drinks with them. He falls asleep in a storm. He wakes up and thinks it's the next morning, but his dog is gone. His musket is rusty. He's grown a beard, and he's not sure what. So he walks back down to the town and is shocked moment by moment by discoveries that he makes as he's entering the village again in what turns out, as we're finding out with him, to have been 20 some odd years that have passed. So clearly something is not right. So I don't want to quote all of this, but I want to give you some of the examples. So there's buildings that are broken down and worn out. There's a tree that has fallen in front of the Dutch Inn. It's been replaced with a tall naked pole with something on the top that looked like a red nightcap. and from it was fluttering a flag on which was a singular assemblage of stars and stripes. So he found a liberty pole, which he had no idea what they were, because King George's face is gone and replaced with George Washington, who he has no idea who he is. He's looking for his friends are gone. And then he says, there was, as usual, a crowd of folk about the door of the inn, but none that Rip recollected. The very character of the people seemed changed. There was a busy, bustling, disputatious tone about it, instead of the accustomed phlegm and drowsy tranquility. So he's looking around, he finds a man screaming about the rights of citizens and elections, members of Congress, liberty, Bunkers Hill, heroes of 76, and other words, which were a perfect Babylonish jargon to the bewildered Van Winkle. So to Irving's readers in 1819, this description just teems with readily accessible signals that the revolution is what has happened in his absence, right? These are the years, all of a sudden 76, Bunker Hill, the Liberty Pole, are very readily accessible as symbols to these folks. But he's taken aback at these villagers who now have a busy, bustling, disputatious tone. So that in particular is something that I've latched onto. I've actually taught the story. It was exciting. My students from Massachusetts don't know anything about Washington Irving or Rip Van Winkle or the Catskill Mountains, or it's west of the Connecticut River, so it doesn't exist to them. But I enjoy teaching it. And that idea of this busy, bustling disputation links in with the work for my first book and my thinking about news and the ways that that changed across the revolution, that's one of the key things that people would have said, oh yeah, this changed over the 20, 30 years. So it's important to stop and point out that professional historians tend to wince, and I used to more, at arguments that try to draw connections directly from past to present. But in this case, I think it's fair and hopefully can convince you in the next 35, 40 minutes that how the news shaped the revolution and vice versa opens useful comparisons for us here in the 2020s. But first, let's turn back to the 18th century and talk about the news environment then and look at how it changed during the American Revolution. So it's hard to talk about printing a newspaper in colonial America without talking about Benjamin Franklin. I picked a portrait that's relatively less familiar, but it's the earliest portrait of him. It was done in the 1740s, and so it portrays him when he was actually still a printer before he'd gone on to become a kite flyer and various other things in his life. His first career was as a printer, running a printing shop, a master craftsman who produced all sorts of goods in early America. In addition to newspapers, almanacs, he's most famous for Poor Richard's, pamphlets, broadsides, which are essentially one-page posters, pre-printed forms, all sorts of things. So for almost 20 years, Franklin was the publisher of the Pennsylvania Gazette, which he turned into the most widely read newspaper in the colonies. And he crucially laid out what became one of the first foundations of ideas about free press in America. It's a little different from what we usually think about. So in 1731, which is what this page is from, he was involved in a dispute about something he'd published in the Gazette, the details of which are far too long and aside for us to worry about here. But in response to this criticism of him having published this particular essay and advertisement, he published a response that became known as the Apology for Printers. And what he essentially said was, I am the printer, I'm a master craftsman, I set the type, I pull the press, but that's it. My press is a forum, my newspaper is a forum for other people to express ideas. I am not deciding what those ideas are. I am simply opening my door and, in print and allowing that to happen in the pages of the newspaper. And so if you hold a printer to account for every single thing that appears in his newspaper, no one will ever print anything. No one will ever get any information about anything. He's a savvy businessman. And if you know about Franklin, you know that one of the things he's famous for is for his own writing in his newspaper. So for him, it's a business strategy very clearly to say, don't blame me. I'm just the guy who's setting the type and pulling the press. He's then using that to then write anonymous essays in various ways to interject into politics, which nobody knows who wrote them, wink, wink. And then he can say, if there's critique, I'm just the guy who pulls the press. But what it's really focused on is 2 points in particular to bring it together is one, the idea that government should not interfere with what is published. So government shouldn't be allowed to license publishing beforehand. And government shouldn't be allowed to punish printing afterwards, right? So it's thinking about both sides of that question. For most printers in colonial America, they picked this up, they ran with it, it worked for them in no small measure because most towns, not Philadelphia, only had one printer and especially only one newspaper, and they're just really small. At independence, Philadelphia has 30,000 people, and that's the largest city in British North America by a lot. Boston's about 15,000. New York, I think, is about 20, right? These are small places. Most places, even with newspapers, are smaller than Irvington is now in terms of the numbers of people. So you don't have a big market where you can afford to anger one political faction. You have to sort of swim this very broad, I'm just trying to appeal to everybody, don't blame me, I'm not taking up any particular faction. It works a little differently in New York and Philadelphia and Boston because they have a bigger market and have 5 or 6 newspapers. But for most, they're it. So they focus on this strategy of don't blame me, I'm just the artisan, and present their newspaper as a public forum. So to do that, because it's slides I really like, and because it helps us understand what happens later, the way that newspapers get put together, they're all printed weekly, first of all. 4 pages, so one larger sheet of paper, usually equivalent today of 11 by 17, folded in half to make 4 pages. And so they're gathering advertisements and then information to print from 3 different kinds of sources. From oral sources, people literally walk into the printing office and go, hey, I just got off the boat from Bristol, here's the latest that's happening in England. Or, I just came in from Boston or whatever, right? So they're literally taking those reports from people. Handwritten reports, they love reprinting snippets of letters. One of the jobs printers often seek is to be the postmaster because people then come to you, they open their mail and go, oh, hey, there's this paragraph about an act that Parliament just passed. Do you want it? Yes, I do want it. I will print that. And then they're looking at other newspapers. So there's this, the clearest analogy is like the Associated Press. It's like a wire service, basically, that they're exchanging newspapers with one another from town to town. So the New York printer would be getting newspapers from Boston and Philadelphia, and he'd grab a paragraph or 2 from each of those to put into his newspaper. And what they end up looking like is like this. So this, I have the slide lined up that it's showing the way it was printed. So this is page 1 and page 4 of the same issue. That the way all of this news then gets organized, my students struggle with this a lot because most of them have never seen a physical newspaper or certainly never read one, which honestly, we subscribe to a Sunday paper as a civic duty and all I do is the crossword. So I read all my news online too at this point. But it's not organized even in the way news websites are organized by headline, by section, right? It's organized by the way it gets printed. And so what you get on these pages 1 and 4 tend to be the stuff that's in early in the week. So all the advertising tends to be on page 4 or page 1 because you can print that a couple days in advance. And then what you get on the inside pages, and it's, I don't know if the folks on the webinar are able to see this any more clearly, but you can see there's a little sort of headings. The top of the 3rd column on page 2 says Boston and then New York again. And if you look, the first column on page 3, about a third of the way down, is the word Philadelphia. So this is a Pennsylvania Journal, Philadelphia paper. That one little 3-line paragraph is it for the local news for that week. And then there's some commercial news from the port in Philadelphia. That next thing is arrivals and departures in the customs office. But they're really focused on generating and circulating news around from other places. They're really small. You can find out what's going on in Philadelphia by going into the coffee house or going into the tavern or going down to the docks and actually talking to people. And if you run the math, women absolutely read newspapers. But in terms of the audience and the people they thought they were talking to were men of means and political activity, which is relatively broader in America than in England. But in a city like Boston, which is 15,000, half the population is kids, half of the adult population is women, half of that population of the men is poor, right? We're already down to, there's about 1,500 men who matter according to their calculation of things. To know what's going on in town, they just talk to each other. They don't need the newspapers for other stuff. So that's what they look like. I lost the page, there we go. So until the 1760s, this is sort of a static process. There's slowly an increasing number of newspapers as the settler population is growing, almost entirely, in fact, entirely through the 1760s along the coast. They're in port towns, none inland until one in the 1750s. Albany gets a paper in 1773 is the first paper there. So they're not really an inland phenomenon. In the 1760s, though, is when we get the start of what we now call the Imperial Crisis, when the colonies, some of them, did battle with Britain over a variety of imperial policies related to the colonies, not least, but not limited to, taxation, and forced printers into rethinking what their political activity and political leaders as well, into rethinking the relationship between news and public opinion. This is particularly clear with the Stamp Act, which is one of the first large-scale taxes imposed by Parliament. A very quick primer. The Stamp Act was passed by Parliament in March of 1765. The idea was that you would tax all printed matter. Anything that went through a printing press had to be stamped. And here, what we're talking about is either something like a notary stamp, where it's literally impressed into the paper, or ink stamps, not lick 'em and stick 'em, nothing like that. That's 19th century, that's later. So the tax included on legal proceedings, indentures, business documents, petitions, bills of lading, and other commercial documents, newspapers, pamphlets, almanacs, books, playing cards had a tax on them because they went through a printing office. Ooh, got your attention, Bo. So the duty ranged from very small, from a half a penny on an almanac, which were a relatively cheap, small piece of print, to there were a couple of pounds for things like mortgages and legal documents that were used by the higher ends of society. To try to make the tax more palatable and to try and collect it more efficiently, Parliament had the idea of not collecting it directly, because they knew people were not thrilled with it, but having a local person in each colony appointed to be the stamp distributor and tax collector. This turned out to be a bad idea. Didn't work out well. So they appointed one for each of the 26 colonies in British North America. And the reason why it's important to remind you that there were 26 is the Stamp Act actually did take effect in 13 of the colonies, in the Canadian colonies and in the various West Indian islands. The tax did take effect. It also was not a new idea. Britain itself, metropolitan Britain in London, had a stamp tax for about 50 years. The newspaper printers there had ways around it. For a while, they printed their newspapers. It was only on newspapers. So they printed their newspapers as pamphlets that just happened to come out every week. Or they would print sheets of advertising alone because the advertising wasn't taxed. And so they'd get their advertising money that way and print those for free. They had all sorts of different strategies to take advantage of. So Parliament didn't think this was a problem, but some of the colonists do. So since it took effect in some of the colonies, we actually have some examples of what it looks like. So this is an issue of the Barbados Mercury from early 1766, which is at the American Antiquarian Society in Worcester, Massachusetts. And you can see in the bottom right corner what that stamp looked like. And the idea was either you had to buy paper that came with the stamp on it from that stamp distributor, or get the stamp made at the end, or you could be subject to any amount of fines. If you tried to counterfeit the stamp, counterfeiting in the colonial era was a capital offense. And yeah, it was serious business. So they warned against counterfeiting, but that's where the stamp is supposed to be, which I want you to keep in mind. Because what the colonists ended up doing in the other 13 colonies was protesting against the Stamp Act. It's supposed to take effect on November 1st. So through that summer and fall, the news has arrived. The printers immediately react to it by printing copies of it. Here's this controversial thing, get your copy from me, half a shilling. They put out their almanacs early as an advert and use it as a sort of marketing technique. The tax is gonna go up on November 1st, so buy them now. So they're thinking in all different ways about this from the get-go, not just about how it's gonna impact them politically. In the 13 colonies from New Hampshire to Georgia, protesters forced the appointed stamp officers to resign. In many of those towns, it's a relatively violent process. Boston, there were multiple riots and they end up destroying several colonial officials' homes. In Savannah, Georgia, the stamp officer was actually in England and he doesn't show up until 3 weeks after November 1st. He gets off the ship and they say, we nullified this act, we're not observing it. And he goes, oh, okay. So there's everything from that range, from destructions of homes to, okay, I guess we're not doing this. The printers themselves turned the newspapers into vehicles of protest. And this was on the advertisement for the talk, if you, on the online version, at least the top of this newspaper, the Pennsylvania Journal, which is published by William Bradford, who's the son of liberty. And so what he does, this is October 31st, 1765. The act's not going to take effect the next day, but he's still acting as if it will. So he's decorated his newspaper, right? That looks like a headstone, right? And all sorts of symbols. The black lines are called mourning borders. The previous time Bradford or really anybody else would have used those would have been announcing the death of George II in 1760, 5 years earlier. Right, it's a rare technique that they're adding in. If you remember from the Barbados Mercury where the stamp was, now there's a skull and crossbones. And if that's not enough, he managed to get somebody to slide in some text on the side that says, adieu, adieu to the liberty of the press. Philadelphia had a procession where they marched with a printing press and a funeral for the liberty of the press. Oh, and wait till you hear what Boston did. So to give you a close-up on the front, there's an emblem of the effects of the stamp. If all of that isn't enough, on the back with some extra advertising space, he wrote himself an epitaph. The last with a coffin as the decoration, the last remains of the Pennsylvania Journal, which departed this life the 31st October 1765 of a stamp in her vitals. Which sounds painful. So there, the act doesn't take effect. Some printers say, I'm not printing. I'm not risking it legally. Technically, in violation of law, they shut down their presses for a couple of months sometimes. In Pennsylvania, they can pre-printing, but don't put their names on the paper at all. Don't even title them with the title of the paper to try and avoid capture. Boston, they just keep going. It's so nice to be in New York. So many Red Sox fans. Okay, but as things are proceeding and they're protesting, there are also these actual stamps out in the wild that they're using in the Caribbean and Canada. And sometimes they show up in these places that have nullified the act, that have made it that you can't use stamps. And so the good and darling people of Boston in February of 1766, one of these stamped papers, I think it was a pass of some kind, it wasn't a newspaper, shows up at the port of Boston. They arrest it ceremonially, and march it through the streets, and then put it on trial for violating Magna Carta and the rights of Englishmen and the British Constitution. A jury deliberates for 2 hours. Have I mentioned they were in a tavern? And then finds it guilty. So they march it back through the streets down to the south end to the Liberty Tree. And there, with an effigy of George Grenville, who wrote the act and is hated at this moment, burn it. Then, because that's not theatrical enough, they write about the whole thing in the newspaper and do this whole write-up is how we know about it. And this is one of my favorite images, colonial newspapers had very few images. They're expensive. They require skilled work that most colonial printers didn't have among the labor in their office. So using what we would call stock images. In a colonial newspaper, you see a ship or a horse or a coffin. somebody did this woodcut engraving specifically for this purpose with Grenville on the right. On the left is Lord Bute, who I know that's him. He was a Scottish advisor to George III. And because he was Scottish, the English settlers, especially in Boston, they had issues with they had issues with everybody. They still have issues with everybody, but he's wearing a kilt. So that's Lord Bute, the Scotsman. And then who's up on top? The devil, holding this piece of paper. The paper itself is so threatening that they're doing this ritually and performatively and ceremonially. But the paper itself they see as such a threat and as personified, anthropomorphized, that they're throwing funerals for it, that they're burning this other paper that's coming in with stamps on it. And printers are leading this because it's a threat to their business. A half a penny tax on an almanac is a really small amount, but that doubles the cost of an almanac, right? A newspaper subscription, you're paying 10 shillings a year. If that goes up to 25 shillings, because you got to pay X amount of tax for your 52 weekly issues in a year, that makes it really, really hard to keep your business alive. So I guess the word of warning for the 2020s would be careful of attacking the communicators because they may come up and bite you. I'm going to skip a whole lot. There's a whole lot that happens in the intervening 6 or 7 years. Printers are at the forefront of protest, on both sides of the equation and in the middle and trying to hew a more moderate line. They're also building networks. So as they're communicating with one another, they're building connections with other printers to be able to say, ooh, if I send my newspaper, you mentioned John Holt, to John Holt in New York, he's a son of liberty. He'll print my news my way, right? And so they're connecting with each other through these other groups. That pays off in the Philadelphia Tea Party, which never happened. So as you may know, in 1773, Boston passes the Tea Act, or not Boston, Parliament passes the Tea Act, which lowered the tax on tea. This is always fun to say. It lowered the tax, it cut it in half. Yes, Americans revolted over a tax cut. It lowered the tax, but increased enforcement of customs duties because they were basically just not paying it at all. Gave the East India Company a monopoly, which was a corrupt act because they were doing that because the East India Company was failing and a whole bunch of members of parliament were invested in the East India Company. So they gave the East India Company this monopoly on tea sales in British North America. In Boston, the ships arrive, 3 of them. A 4th one actually shipwrecked off the coast of Cape Cod. But 3 of them arrive at the end of November. According to customs law, they have 3 weeks to clear customs for the customs officer to look at the manifest and say, this is all the goods on ship. Here are the taxes you're paying. You can unload them. Patriots won't let them unload. The customs officer won't let them leave. The 3 weeks are almost up. They disguise themselves as what they call Mohawks, go down to the docks and dump 340 chests of tea into Boston Harbor on December 16th, 1773, also inventing cold brew while they were at it. Oh, thank you. Some groups that just sailed by. Then they spread the news. So Paul Revere, it wasn't just the one ride, he gets on his horse and heads south to bring the news of this to New York and then Philadelphia. He arrives in Philadelphia on Christmas Eve, on December 24th, 1773. With this news. The printer, William Bradford, immediately puts the news to press as a Christmas box for his customers. And in a different version I can go through, you can actually see the networks in this one piece of paper. The first part and the last part are from the Massachusetts Spy, which is Isaiah Thomas's newspaper, which was published the morning before. So it's updates of things from that morning of the meetings. There's a section where there's a letter from the New York Committee of Correspondence that Revere was carrying with him. And then where it says Thursday, most of the way down that first column and onto the second column is an actual account of the Tea Party that appears nowhere else. I am reasonably certain in my guess that that's what Paul Revere walked into the office and told William Bradford had happened when he got there. The next newspapers, not Thursday, were printed Monday, it happened on a Thursday. were printed the following Monday in Boston, and the story had shifted in nuance. It hadn't changed completely, but the details of it were different. And what I think is Revere's account doesn't appear anywhere but in this. And trust me, I spent hours messing with online newspaper databases for early American papers looking. So they have the news from Boston. This is what happens. By coincidence, the tea ship headed for Philadelphia shows up in Delaware Bay on Christmas morning, the very next day. So what the Philadelphia Sons of Liberty do is they stop the ship outside of, it's a 10-mile radius from the actual port that Customs has control of the ship. So it's not going to have the customs problem. They bring the ship captain into town, and 2 days after Christmas, they have a big town meeting with thousands of people. They show him this and essentially say in colonial English, you wouldn't want something like this to happen to your ship, would you? And he says no, and turns the ship around. I've never found records for the ship. I often wonder, after being 8 weeks on the North Atlantic in November and December, what his sailors did to him on the way back on the trip in January and February. But he leaves. The news network works. They've got this network set up with printers, with people like Revere and the Sons of Liberty and the Boston Committee of Correspondence and other committees of correspondence that make these things happen and that can leverage a moment like this into political action. And in this case, have an actual real world, I love this. It's the only smoking gun I have where I can actually say this like directly, just so neatly. So glad that ship showed up Christmas morning. So as the war went on, as the war began, printing became incredibly difficult. By 1775, there were about 45 newspapers in the colonies, and then the war just wreaked havoc on everybody. Printers had to abandon their printing offices with some frequency because of occupation by one, or if you're a loyalist, you leave when the Continental Army shows up. If you're a patriot, you leave when the British show up. It was just difficult to get supplies. Paper and ink are in short supply. Labor, printing offices, like most trade offices, rely on the labor of young men who are often called away to military responsibilities in one way, shape, or form. So by 1783, there's the same number of papers. There's still 45. But in the next 20 years or so, it begins to explode. And so in those 25 years, there's 10 times as many newspapers as there were at the end of the war, which is even more than the rapid expansion of the American population in that era. It's more than the per capita population. And the types of newspapers changed. And Chet, let's go, we've got one animation on this, so we're gonna do that. Like newspapers in the early republic of all different kinds. So before the war, everything's weekly and everything this sort of grab bag of every kind of news. Starting after the war, New York is the first city to have a daily newspaper in 1783. There begin to be more specialized, at least in New York and Philadelphia and Boston, commercial newspapers that are focused exclusively on commercial news. News of ships coming and going they were sometimes called prices current. They would list the prices of various goods for merchants who were interested in that sort of thing. And then you get papers that focus more exclusively on politics. All of this is aided by an expansion and a change in the way that the post office was designed. In 1792, Congress passed a Post Office Act to permanently and finally establish the post office, bless you, in the United States. And what they did is it didn't favor first-class letters. It was designed for circulating this kind of information. It was really expensive to send a letter. It was really cheap to send somebody a newspaper and to send news. And so individuals pick up on this, and there's evidence later in the 19th century before the pricing changed to switch the letter newspaper relationship. During the gold rush, people would go to San Francisco and they'd mail their family back a newspaper and circle, acrostic. They'd circle like one letter in each line as a way to send a message hidden in the newspaper, made it MITSF, made it to San Francisco, alive, or something like that, to try and get around having to pay the more expensive expensive rates. And the post office had ways of trying to figure that out, which is why they're doing things like circling letters instead of just writing in the margins. But they make the newspapers the key feature of the postal system. They make the postal system one that will grow with the nation. They make Congress responsible for paying for post roads. Everybody wants a post road because it connects you into the network and because the federal government will pay. We don't have to pay for our own road to hook us up to the next county center because Congress will take care of that. That means that in the 1790s, the newspapers actually become the first organizing backbone of America's first set of political parties. Through these networks of partisan political editors who are circulating news, who are amplifying arguments, who are promoting their own candidates, and just, I wrote pillorying here, they're just ripping into their political opponents. But printing itself remains a hard way to make a living. It's not a way to, Benjamin Franklin is the exception in that he retires and retires very successfully and wealthy. Most printers die from printing sometimes because of the physical labor breaks their body. You're pulling a press for years on end and doing hard physical labor. So it wears the body down and you're not making a lot of money. So what these partisan editors get drawn into is jobs in the government. So Philip Freneau, who was a poet, he went to Princeton, he did all sorts of things. He also became an editor for the Jeffersonian faction of the National Gazette. And what Jefferson did was he gave him a job in the State Department while he was Secretary of State, a sinecure, a job, right, a nothing job, make work jobs so that he had a salary, and then on the side he could do this. Hamilton does the same thing for several Federalists. Locally, they're starting to do this. Printers are competing for government contracts at the state and national level because that's how you can actually make some money and have a reliable source of income. So at a certain level, press freedom and public opinion even become central points of debate in national politics. So it's an open question whether people should vote and then be quiet for 2 years and let their representatives govern, right? Is that you expressing your voice and you should limit it to that? Or should you be constantly telling your representatives what you want? Should they be following your instructions on a monthly, weekly, daily basis? Is criticism of the government, of government policy, actually an act of undermining the government itself? Those are open questions in the 1790s and questions that come up for really important debate. It's great for historians of the press because we have lots of stuff to read and write about. It also actually helps explain one of the lousier acts in American history, the Sedition Act of 1798. That act created criminal penalties for criticizing government officials, which sounds terrible, and I think it is. But there's some important content. The question of, is criticizing policy undermining of the government itself? That's where it comes from. In 1798, the US is in the midst of trying to avoid war with Britain and France, or getting sucked into the Britain and France. There's still the French Revolutionary Wars. They haven't yet turned into the Napoleonic Wars. It's the midst of the quasi-war with France, where there is some low-grade conflict going on. Domestically, the administration of John Adams is just facing barrages of opposition and criticism from Republicans who were much better at newspapers than the Federalists. And so if you are a Federalist in Congress and you believe, as they did, that attacking the policies of the government undermined the legitimacy of that government, if attacking the president undermined the presidency, then yeah, there's a way in which it makes sense. As I say in my notes, it was still a terrible idea. And this is actually, I love this print. It's Griswold, who's a congressman from Connecticut, and Matthew Lyon, who was a newspaper printer and congressman from Vermont. And the two of them ended up fighting with fireplace tongs in the well of the House of Representatives. Lyon was one of the printers who was arrested and charged under the Sedition Act. And a number of them were, including as it happens, none other than Benjamin Franklin's grandson, because of course I was going to bring it back to Franklin. His grandson was named Benjamin Franklin Beach, who was trained as a printer by his grandfather. He became a leading Republican printer in Philadelphia and publisher of a newspaper called the Aurora and General Advertiser. To give you a sense of, this is what he says when he hates Adams. This is what he says on the day Adams is inaugurated and Washington leaves office. If ever there was a period for rejoicing, this is the moment. Every heart in unison with the freedom and happiness of the people ought to beat high with exultation that the name of Washington from this day ceases to give a currency to political iniquity and to legalize corruption. This day ought to be a jubilee in the United States. Now, Washington had come down a couple of pegs, but he's still George Washington. He's already 25 feet tall and single-handedly did everything. And right, he's the hero of the revolution. And Beach hates John Adams. But this is what he says about. So this is just a sample of what Washington has been dealing with. So if you were a Rip Van Winkle and you woke up in 1798 or 1800 and saw this, the world looks a lot more vicious. It's moving a lot faster. It's really disorienting. So, it's a fair argument to say that a lot of us may feel like that as well. And over the past 40 years, the pace of the news cycle has undergone another massive acceleration from an era in which people received newspapers once or maybe twice a day, checked in on the day's events on an evening network newscast. Thank you, Walter Cronkite, and perhaps caught an update or two on news radio. Now, those same news store organizations are posting stories to their websites as they're going on, right? New York Times has live blogs of events and things. And there's God knows how many different competitors. This slide is the one that took me the longest because I didn't have it beforehand, but I had fun pulling all these logos. Right, so you have more traditional news, CNN, New York Times, even MSNBC and Fox, which at this point are traditional news. And then you can go get your news on TikTok or Twitter or Instagram or wherever. So one of the things that makes this work is not the same sort of wire service sort of exchange of editors, but is an algorithm, right? Which is a machine learning process that predicts what you individually are likely to click on. If each of us goes and Googles a news event that's happening today, we'd each get different results because of our search histories and what it thinks each of us want. Right? If there are Democrats in the room, they'll get MSNBC results. If there are Republicans in the room, they'll get Fox News results. If there are people who are just sick of everything, they'll get Pinterest groups or something. I don't know. So the point is, when you open that or when you open Facebook or Twitter, you're only seeing a slice of the picture, and it's a slice that a human has designed a machine learning process to pick for you. Those algorithms are held by corporations, right? Who have none of, Franklin was running a business, but he had a notion, at least projected, of serving in the public interest. This is a public forum, this newspaper. I don't think any of these corporations particularly care about, they're interested, the corporations, the corporate level, the individual journalists, it varies, but they're interested in the corporate. They're interested in getting you to click on the advertisement and buy another thing. And there's evidence that the algorithms that are designed introduce and reinforce all sorts of different biases. Right, I mentioned political, but gender, racial biases in all sorts of ways. These manifest through results that privilege particular perspectives, or assume that searches for terms about people who are Black or female or both offer results that presume the worst stereotypes about them. And this is coming from research by media scholars today. Where if you research Black girls, the results will be tangibly more negative because of the way the algorithms are designed. So the other big difference, other than this, is the ideal of objectivity, which you'll notice I haven't mentioned until now. It didn't exist in the 18th century. That's not what news producers thought they were doing. They thought they were being free of government interference and impartial in their dealings with other people. And that's sort of what they aimed for. Objectivity it's an artifact of the Columbia Journalism School and the New York Times. There's nothing wrong with the Columbia Journalism School. but it's an artifact of the early 20th century, the New York Times and the Walter Cronkite sort of, I am the objective, disembodied voice of news and factual information without a perspective, without anything. And that, there's one thing everybody can agree on is probably that doesn't exist anymore. So one of the things I like to do in my talks is point out that what we sometimes think of as a golden age or this standard is actually a blip in what is a much longer history that looks much more like, what we're headed towards is what looks much more like the 18th and early 19th centuries, is this place where people are openly partisan and conscious of it and working from that perspective. So one tip to hand out to you, and this is most recently useful in Texas a couple weeks ago, unfortunately. The biggest skill tool we have, my exhortation, is information literacy and thinking about understanding it. I would not simply dismiss journalism out of hand, unless you have good reason to believe that. But this was produced by On the Media, one of the WNYC podcasts, and it's a really useful tool. Number one, most important, in the immediate aftermath, news outlets will get it wrong. Right, and in the Uvalde, Texas shoot, everybody was getting it wrong from the first thing. But things like trusting the Texas newspapers over the one reporter the New York Times sent or the one reporter that CNN sent in those kinds of situations can be useful. As I try and talk with my students to think broadly about sources, understand where they're coming from. If I want to find out what's going on in the Republican Party, I don't ask MSNBC. If I want to find out what's going on in the Democratic Party, I don't ask Fox, right? Their sources are better the other way, and thinking about that. So now that I've talked largely about the 18th century and talked about my expertise in the 18th century and then finished with the 21st century, I will close there. Leave you with if anybody has questions they want to ask later, and a lovely copy of my book. The press did a great job with that. Thank you for sitting and listening. I look forward to your questions.
I have a question.
There's already a question from online, or is it you?
No, this is a question from me.
Okay.
We think about news today, and there's a lot of dynamic of how the First Amendment plays out as a restriction on governmental control, and then how much that should or should not apply to private parties. What was I don't know if you know, prior to the Revolutionary War, prior to the Constitution, what was the kind of legal construct that these publishers were working in? Was there overt censorship by the government, or were they left to their own devices, or what?
They're mostly left to their own device. So if we're talking British colonial.
Yes.
They're mostly left to their own devices. But there is some use of libel law against printers in particular circumstances, usually by government entities. So the famous example from New York is the John Peter Zenger trial, which was not as important a precedent for press freedom as New York sometimes thinks it is. But in that case, he was just a printer. He was largely a German language speaker. He did not have very good English, but he got picked up by the Morrisite political faction. And it's good that Pat Bonamy is not here, or bad, she could do the whole thing. A rival to the faction of the sitting governor. His name was William Cosby. Always trip up on. And so Cosby had him charged as he's the printer. And so legally he's responsible because all these guys writing their essays are publishing them anonymously. They don't give their name. And they don't have to. It's the standard to write anonymously because it's supposed to be the power of your arguments and not the name on the page. There are a couple of examples during the Revolutionary Era where they're printing things that weren't supposed to be made public under standards of the time, but they're largely left to themselves. The law says that they be held liable. Truth is not a defense in the way that American jurisprudence largely holds it. You can be held for liable even if what you say is true. But one of the things that always surprises me about reading about the revolution and reading the British officials and what they're saying is they barely even talk about using libel law. And I think part of it is just the political atmosphere. What jury in Boston was going to convict a patriot printer of libel for saying mean stuff about Thomas Hutchinson?
Other questions? Yeah. How did you get interested in all this, Joe? How did you start thinking about it?
Career. So the question is from Dr. Mosenthal. It's about how I got interested in all of this.
In your background, so now this is what you do.
This is what I do.
Yeah.
You
didn't become a classical professor.
I did not become a classical professor.
Yes, I was hoping for that.
I had a semester where I thought about it, and then I took a college level Latin class, and it was more than I could handle. It was a good class. I learned about the Catalan Wars, but the Catalan never mind. We'll deal with that later. I mean, I have always been interested in history. The credit in Irvington goes to Mrs. Duell, my second grade teacher, who, as legend has it, handed me a book about the revolution, and off I went. So thank you, Mrs. Duell, wherever you are.
She's in Tarrytown.
She's in Tarrytown? Okay, well, there you go. When I got to college, I was interested in early American history and took a bunch of classes, got interested in, I usually like to say that my book is a more narrow version of my undergraduate thesis. I had this sort of big idea I was going to write all about national identity and write how the revolution happened and how people came to think of why these 13 and how they came together. But I did a bunch of research in college about the revolution and the relationships of these various committees and newspapers. I did some work early in graduate school on the post office, and that got me hooked on the post office, and built from there, and happened to hit at a good moment. I mentioned the online databases. So the Antiquarian Society has the single largest collection of early American newspapers. In the 1950s, they digitized them, which meant somebody took photographs and put them on microfilm. In the 90s, they scanned those microfilms and put them online, and they have text behind it, optical character recognition. They have text recognition behind them. So you can go in and search the newspapers. It's a frustrating process because the Fs look like S's, or the S's look like Fs, and there's sometimes a smudge. And every once in a while, because the older ones are digital reproductions of a film of something like a thumb of the person who took the photograph. So those words are just gone. But I was able to do this sort of, cute. To do this work that wouldn't have been possible 15 years before. Yeah, I know what it is. I know what my father's trying to hand me.
Let's try and get it up there.
There's not a way to do that. There's not a way to get the embarrassing picture you wanted to share. You'll have to pass it around by hand to the people in the room.
Fix it in post.
We'll fix it in post, yeah. So 15 years before, I couldn't have done this kind of work of tracking where these paragraphs are being, right? It would have just taken me 35 years to read every single newspaper. Where this, I could punch in a phrase from a story and say, oh, it appeared in 10 other newspapers, which 10? And sort of track some of where news stories are going and how fast and who's reprinting them and things like that.
Yeah, I have a quick question and a comment. I've already picked up your book here.
Excellent.
Page 155. I mean, I'm really interested in the printing of the Declaration of Independence. I mean, some comments on that would be encouraged, but I also like to know, I didn't learn from you, but were you on the high school newspaper staff?
I was. There was a 6-month period where I was the only member of the high school newspaper staff. It was a year where it sort of fell apart. I think I was the only person.
The printing of the Declaration.
So yes, the printing of the Declaration of Independence deserves its own 45-minute talk. So what can I say in a short answer to a question that's just talk about the Declaration? So it's, the parchment that we revere as a holy document, nobody saw for decades.
Right.
Excuse me. Congress had it made after July 4th, They signed it, they rolled it up and carried it with them when they escaped the British. It was stored in the State Department until the 1820s. John Quincy Adams, when he was Secretary of State, had an engraving made because the text was already fading so badly because they weren't using, heaven forfend, they weren't using late 20th and early 21st century conservation techniques to preserve the document. So that's was done by a man named Stone. One of the more touching things is if you go to the John Adams house in Quincy, Mass., John Quincy Adams, as Secretary of State, sent copies all around. And so the copy that he sent to his dad is like sitting on the wall somewhere, which is really nice. But that, like, nobody saw it until like the Cold War, before people actually started like looking at that. What they looked at in 1776 was what was printed on July 4th by a printer named John Dunlap and circulated around. There are 26 copies currently in existence. When the 26th showed up, it was literally in the back of a painting, a frame that somebody had a painting in the attic, and they were taking the frame and like, there's this old piece of paper, and they walked into a library in Philadelphia and were like, is this anything? And the librarian practically fell over and said, So they circulated to the 13 states. They circulated to England because it is, of course, a Dear John letter. They circulated to France, right? They want people to know about this. They then have it, various places have it reprinted. So New York, as you know from your card, for the Westchester 250th, had copies printed. They were meeting in White Plains. And had copies printed in Boston. They had copies printed and circulated to every town to be read by the minister from the church pulpit. This is one of those fun things we're talking about, freedom to worship. And the changing meanings of the relationship of church and state is they use the churches as a distribution network for communication, because every town had a church and everybody went to it. So so each colony/state then had their own printer, print up a bunch of copies. It takes about 6 weeks, no, a little less than that, 4 weeks for it to appear in pretty much all the newspapers that were in publication at that point. From there I could do another 45 minutes, but I won't be able to. Thanks. There are other questions. Yeah.
Yeah, just you mentioned sort of the current corporate media landscape. I wonder if you had any thoughts, observations on versus something like Substack.
Yes. So sorry, the question is about in the modern environment and Substack and how that fits in. So Substack, we need to do a little primer on what Substack is. Substack is a newsletter service. So it's individuals use that platform to publish email newsletters. So you could sign up for the Joe Edelman newsletter, and once a week I will email you an essay. So it's a little bit like a blog, except I'm emailing it straight to you at your Gmail account or AOL or whatever. And there's been this trend, especially among a certain type of media figure, to leave their established post as a column at the Washington Post or at Slate or the Atlantic or wherever, and just publish the newsletter for pay. That you can, some of them are free, some of them are subscription, and some of them some of the essays are free, and you get more if you pay like $5 a month. Actually, one of the people making the most money from it is a historian named Heather Cox Richardson, who writes Letters from an American, which I don't know how she has any energy left, but she publishes daily since the beginning of the Ukraine impeachment inquiry in 2019. That she's been publishing 1,500, 2,000 words every single day about American politics and how it fits historically and various other things. And it's completely free, but you can pay $5 a month, and thousands of people are paying $5 a month for that. So how does that fit in? I mean, I think I'm sort of giving away that in my sense, it's probably a pretty niche thing in terms of like a high earning, any kind of thing. It's hard. So a couple people have done that. And then immediately on the social media channels I follow, which are like historians and some contemporary media, because I'm interested in these kinds of connections, I wish we could bundle these into something like, a publication or a magazine, or right. So I sort of wonder in 5 years if this is going to just sort of start folding back in on itself, where it's just going to be different news magazines. But it's certainly an interesting and direct way to reach people. Some of my friends who are sort of in my own Heather Kupchurch is off on her own, doing her own thing with hundreds of thousands of dollars in revenue on her Substack. But I have a couple of friends who are using newsletters, and they find it a useful tool for people who are interested in public writing about the past. And, on a certain level, all of this is about, in terms of now, is thinking about who your audience is and what you want from it. So
here's a question from the chat.
Okay.
How do they get away with censoring the press in other countries like Russia? Do they have government editors in the newspaper office to review every article? Who controls what's allowed?
I'm an American historian, so we'll start there. And actually, both words are relevant. I don't know a ton about contemporary Russia. One of the things I know, excuse me, so not colonial, 18th century England and France, or 17th century England, there were licensing. You had to have a license to print. The government had to approve you using a printing press before you actually set a single letter and ran it through, put it on paper. 18th century France, there were censors who would go in and read your stuff and burn it if they didn't like it. To the extent that I know about more contemporary authoritarian regimes that tend to engage in press censorship, they tend to be better at being subtle. So it's less about specific content restrictions than making particular choices about who gets funded and what get right, that they're making choices and pushing and leaning things in ways that make it so they don't have to do content censorship, because either Russia, I think there's a state-run media channel, right? They hire people who are going to say the things that Putin wants them to say, right? Or Orban in Hungary or wherever. And so that you don't have to worry about specifically orchestrating content because you've already steered everything beforehand in that sort of way. So I don't know a lot about authoritarian regimes and press censorship in 21st century global politics, but that's the little bit I do know, I think, is that they're getting better at being subtle. So that's not a compliment that they're getting better. It's just that they're, yes, sir.
Joseph,
Go ahead.
Joseph, you were talking about the future. How do you see what is going to happen in the United States? I'm asking you to put a hat on and predict the future, but in terms of the media and the search for truth or where facts are or not, are we going down a slippery slope to oblivion, or is there hope?
Okay, so just for the folks at home, the question is, can I please predict the future? How do I put this? I'm worried, as a general principle. History does not repeat itself. History does not necessarily offer directly useful lessons. But when historians get together in the last couple of years to talk, we're hearing some pretty loud echoes of like the 1850s. Which for anyone for whom that doesn't ring a bell, the Civil War started in 1861. So the 1850s is not a good place to go. The 20th century historians go to the 1930s, right? Like we're not, the echoes we're hearing are not great. In terms of news specifically, I think the news industry is in a really roiled state, roiled, churned. Their profit model from the 50s to the 90s, the 1950s to the 1990s, was largely through print advertising and the monopoly in print advertising. And that's gone. And even online on news sites, the people who are getting most of the ad revenue is Google, right? Even like the New York Times and CNN, the ads you see on those sites are through Google AdSense. And so Google's the one getting the revenue, not the Times, not CNN, not Fox, not whoever. So the revenue models have just been exploded. And Substack, I think, is one response to that, where individuals are saying, I can do this without having to go through all this rigmarole and how's the journal news doing? Because the news in west of Boston is sort of collapsing. There's one paper, it's owned by USA Today, so it's mostly there's very little local reporting that's very useful. There's one reporter who covers anything that happens. Framingham's a city of 70,000, so it's right like there's one reporter who covers anything that happens in the city council, the school committee, the zoning, all that stuff. So a lot gets missed. And we're lucky because we also have the Boston Globe. And in Irvington, even if the Journal News falls down, there's the Times and a couple other papers in the city that every once in a while might remember that Westchester exists. So I'm sorry if you're looking for optimism, I don't have it. I have some in that there are people trying to think through things. They're fighting with the idea of objectivity. They're fighting with the idea of at an individual and an institutional level of like, what do you do when someone lies and you know it's a lie? Who is responsible for responding to that?
Let's do one more question, then I think we have to end this.
Sure.
Yes. Joe, what news source do you find is the most even-handed and reliable?
There's no way I'm answering that question on a recording. The question was, which news source do I find most even-handed? What I've come up with for me is I am a power user, an obsessive user, an abuser of Twitter. And so what I would say is I've tried to build a Twitter feed of people and institutions I follow where collectively I feel like I'm understanding what's going on. So I guess the cop-out answer is not, I won't answer it. The cop-out answer is I don't trust any one source. Right? When the shooting happened in Texas, I read the Times coverage, but when there was a story posted by San Antonio, I forget what the paper's called down there, or the Texas Tribune is a news organization that has a lot of, for the Texas school shooting, that was where I went. For other things, it's other places, right? And pulling sources together. But I've been on Twitter for 12 years, and so I've been pulling sources and trying to figure out, it's much harder than when you can just turn on CBS and watch Cronkite, or turn on NBC and watch Huntley and Brinkley, or turn on the New York Times and assume that what you were getting was sort of an objective. Although even that, I have I'll close with the Little Rock school desegregation, because I teach about that in a different class. And there's an image in the New York Times of the Black children getting into a station wagon to be taken to school by the army. And in the Times, that's all you see. There's a video of that, and what the Times cropped out is that in front of the station wagon and behind the station wagon are heavily armed soldiers in Jeeps. You get a really different effect from watching the video and seeing the frame pulled out just that little bit than you do from what describes itself as a nonpartisan, impartial, objective 1957 New York Times, where all they've done is crop out and closed in, where you just see the kids getting in the station wagon, instead of seeing that they're accompanied by armed guards in Jeeps that look like they should be in a John Wayne World War II movie. Right. And those, but which is the point of saying, like, ask questions and think about and don't trust any one source, is that kind of thing. Is there's always editorial decision making going on, whether it's partisan or practical or whatever.
Okay. So
yes.
Thank you, Joe. That was fabulous. Giving us a lot to think about. Thank you all for joining us today. And remember, if you've missed any part of the program or would like to recommend it to a friend, it has been recorded and will be on our website at irvingtonhistoricalsociety.org.